Welcome to Strata. I'm Glenn.
And I'm Brandon. Welcome to the Minds on Muscle podcast.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Minds on Muscle podcast. My name is Glenn, and today I'm with my co-host.
It's Brandon.
And today we are talking about post-activation potentiation. And I know he's going to hum and haw, but as far as I'm concerned, I'm talking to one of the most leading authorities on PAP that I know in the applied exercise science world. And that's you, Brandon Green.
Well, that's very kind of you. I definitely would hum and haw at that. I would not say that about myself. I'm just someone who likes learning about this stuff and seeing where it fits in with the whole contractile phenomenon. So thank you. That's a very polite lead-in.
Well, you are welcome. I wholeheartedly believe that's true. PAP stands for post-activation potentiation. And as I understand, Brandon, you actually, I shouldn't even say I understand. I know that you've led a course on this many times before.
Yeah, I ended up creating a course, and I'm excited to talk about it today and talk about the phenomenon a little bit more. The whole course, which is called Post-Activation Potentiation Preparation, which is a big mouthful, but it came really from some self-exploration. Much like every trainer that I know, I was introduced to these passive modalities to make changes to the body: stretching, rubbing, foam rolling, all these things which involve some sort of external stimulus, whether it be me, the trainer on my client, or some device to try to force someone's body to make change. And that change usually had to do with tightness, someone feeling pain, limited motion, posture, something of that nature. And I did a lot of those passive modalities for years and spent a lot of money learning about them. What I started to see with those passive modalities is that no matter what I would do, it would seem that a lot of those modalities would have similar outcomes where there'd be increased range of motion changes. Sometimes the client would feel good, sometimes not. And it was really kind of a mixed bag as to what would happen. And it was tough because several of those modalities had protocol-like recommendations, like if you see this, you do this, then this, then this, and then recheck this, and it turns into this outcome. And in reality, and I've said this in previous episodes, that's nearly impossible because anything that's good for everyone, any protocol on the human body, which is an extremely dynamical system, it's impossible to quantify. And so a good friend of mine, Charlie McMillan, started exposing me to some information about post-activation potentiation, not so much as a panacea by any means, but an unexplored phenomenon, at least in our paradigm, as to what's going on within skeletal muscle tissue and how it contracts and what happens after it contracts within specific parameters that may make some of the changes that we're seeing, the range of motion improvements, the force production improvements. And if that's the case, could we streamline our process, make it simpler with more information and learning about post-activation potentiation? And so that's why the course is called PAP Preparation, is because everything that we are doing in warm-up strategies and preceding sets to a working set, I believe really is a preparation for the potentiation phenomenon, a preparation for the exercise. And so that whole course is really explaining, going over all the mechanisms that I've understand to be connected with PAP. Even now, there's more and more that I'm adding to it, and how we can streamline our warm-up and exercise prep processes and maybe even rehab protocols for people in that paradigm to make the changes they want faster and potentially even more long-term lasting.
And you know, it's interesting because a lot of times when people think about warming up or preparing for exercise, it's not really a sexy topic. People are much more interested in things like sets and reps and what exercise is and how can we change those kind of parameters in order to have the best outcome or the best results. So often the warm up or the preparation is kind of left to the wayside. And if you don't mind me saying, I think the PAPP course actually brings sexy back to the warm up. So before we go into too much of the nitty gritty, Brandon, what is post-activation potentiation?
So post-activation potentiation basically has to do with skeletal muscle's previous contractile history. And so Robbins and a few other of the authors who've wrote papers on PAP will describe PAP as a contractile history phenomenon that after there's a contraction within skeletal muscle, that there's increase in rate of force development and force development based off of several different mechanisms, things like H reflex, pennation angle to be more optimal for force production, excitation of the nervous system, which falls under the H reflex, increased calcium sensitivity and increased phosphorylation in the myosin light chains. It's a lot of different things that happen, which is really cool. And even if only one of those mechanisms happen, all of which increase how quickly skeletal muscle can produce force and how much force those muscles can produce. Now, this mechanism does seem to be more favorable for fast twitch fibers, but not exclusive to. And there are parameters that are really specific. Like, for example, if you cause pain or some inhibitory nociceptive response, the force production, or rate of force production will not be the same magnitude if you don't. If you fatigue the muscles, you start losing contractile substrates, and then you're not going to be able to perform at the same high level of rate of force development and force development. Now, I know that sounds like a lot of fancy gobbledygook to say, but in reality, one of the few quotes that consistently comes up is that every time you contract skeletal muscle, it's likely the PAP response is happening. And so I find that to be one of the most fascinating things with this, is because we have so many things that we do with our body. And every time we contract our muscles with some deliberate position or intent, it involves even just going down the stairs, playing drums, grabbing weights, our body is getting better and better and better at the subsequent activity that we're going to do based off of the post-activation, the pre-activating we've done to be more prepared to increase the potential, right? Post-activation potentiation to do that thing. And I think this is one of the reasons, I mean, it makes perfect sense. I think a really funny example, but a relatable one, is for more experienced exercisers, right? And Glenn, I'm sure you've experienced this with your weightlifting, is that if you've done a consistent workout regime for a year, and then you go on to vacation to Punta Cana, you have a nice week off, you have some drinks, you relax, you don't do any weightlifting, or you try to go to the gym, but they got those rusty weight gyms that every resort seems to have by being too close to water. So it's a really ineffective experience. Then you come back, and the first day you try to pick up some of the weights you did the week prior, even just 1 week later, they feel immensely too heavy. Really, really heavy, like 30, 40% heavier than you might expect. And that's like, oh, it's like, well, is it because you didn't work out for a week? Did you lose all that muscle? Absolutely not. You did not lose that muscle. There's a lot of things that are going on there, right? There's definitely, if you drank a bunch of alcohol, some toxicity and changes to the substrates and energy in your muscles. But is it possible that 8 to 9 days taken away from stimulating those motor patterns and those muscles, your body started to focus on other things and became slightly depotentiated, or I don't want to say depotentiated, but less efficient at those patterns? Because I do find it, I don't know if you, and please let me know if you've had this experience, the first day you come back, you feel really weak and weird, even if you slept and you've detoxed, so to speak, and you've eaten healthy. But then you go back the second day and you feel great. And you're like, oh, my strength's all back. And it only took 1 day. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really sounds like PAP gives credence to something that's we've always kind of known, always kind of felt underneath the surface, which is, when we do the right warm-up set for the right sets and the right amount of weight or the right amount of reps, however you're looking at it, it tends to impact our first working sets or whatever it is that you're doing from an exercise perspective positively. Likewise, I suppose you could say the same thing for any kind of sport warm-up, where if the athletes are going through the right warm-up, doing the right exercises, the right movements, and the right tempos, and with the right muscular contractions, they're going to be best prepared to do their sport when the whistle blows or it's time to kick off, rather than somebody who's just going to it cold.
Yeah, and it's funny because as we described, there's a couple things, right? It's based off of the historical contractions someone has done. So how conditioned someone's body is for how much muscle they've developed, how many times they've done the type of active warm-ups, so on and so forth, how much torque they've experienced makes a huge difference. And also, there's a huge difference between the effect, it seems, between the different modes of contraction. So maximal voluntary isometric contractions and maximal voluntary eccentric contractions, plyometric contractions that stay far away from fatigue, seem really effective. So coming back to the example you just talked about, you take a bunch of 20-year-old high-level professional athletes who have done the same warm-ups for years and years and years and years. They're doing ballistic jumping style warm-ups. They jump off of a box, they jump off of one leg, they swing their other leg into hip flexion, and so on and so forth. I find that interesting because all of those things, when they land and hit the ground, then they shock absorb that force. They're dissipating all that force eccentrically, whether they're aware of it or not. If an athlete has more power and more strength, they're probably going to go higher in the warm up, even subconsciously. So there's all this contraction that's happening based off of all that angular displacement. And they're so conditioned that it doesn't take nearly as much stimulus to stimulate their body to be that same high level. So I think that's really fascinating. My position when we're talking about PAP, outside of talking about athletes, is when we're talking about regular exercisers and personal trainers. I think that if we can learn more about what post-activation potentiation is, and forgetting about the words, it's not a panacea, it's not some special treatment, but understand when you contract the muscles strategically at a very high level, staying away from pain and fatigue, you get some amazing changes to force production and rate of force development, which you can see that translate to range of motion, changes in posture and position, how light and or easy someone moves their body and picks up weight. If we can learn more about that, we can create customized warm-ups to bias an individual's individualized contractile areas to get better for what they want to do. And there's ways that I personally use it. But to bow tie that same statement, what I'm not talking about, which I think a lot of people expect when they come to this course, is I'm not telling you you have to do 10 minutes, 15 minutes, half hour, even necessarily 5 minutes of potentiation exercises before every single exercise or a workout, because I think that idea of doing a whole series of mobility and warm-up drills before activity, for a resistance exercise at the very least, may be going the wrong direction as well. It should be really about, where do you need to improve contractions? How can you expedite that process? Can you measure it? And if you can you consistently measure it to see over time how things are changing? Because in most cases, for me, my potentiation sets, if I do them, are maybe 3 to 5 reps. I mean, today I deadlifted and I literally did 6 reps on each leg to focus on hip extension eccentrically. And then I started practicing and warming up my deadlifts a much more traditional way, where I would increase the weight over time. And I found that to be really effective. But get that same streamlined, quick warm up, it's taken me a few years where I had to practice the warm up sets, teach my glutes how to perform in that but experience those contractions in that same way over time. So now I'm in a much more chronically adapted state where my body can be prepared much faster.
So you said something interesting there. You talked about this chronically adapted state. And I know from going through the PAP course myself that there is a short-term potentiation and there's a long-term potentiation. Could you maybe define the two or delineate the two so listeners know what we're talking about?
So I'll first, yeah, for sure. So I'll first off start by saying that short-term potentiation and long-term potentiation is not limited to skeletal muscle adaptations. In fact, those original terms, when I first learned about them, come much more from cognitive ability, skill, and performance. But I do believe there's a component where there is skill. So if we take like the 3 steps of motor learning, right? There's a cognitive stage, an associative stage, and then an autonomous stage. When you learn something new, you have to be kind of aware of it, being able to visualize it, use your learning centers to figure it out. So you have to be cognitive of what you're doing. Once you learn it, to expedite that process through Hebbian learning, we need to go from cognitive to associative. So how can you take that cognitive process and can you associate it with something else that you've learned to make it a much faster learning? So maybe it's a position, type of contraction, type of exercise. And then over time, that associative learning starts to become much more autonomous. So if we go back to what you were asking, short-term potentiation versus long-term potentiation, right? PAP is commonly associated with as an acute response. So you do something, you contract a muscle, right? Post-activation, it gets potentiated, increases in performance, and that's a quick acute, right? Acute's not a bad thing. Acute's a quick response to adjust to what you did, to be more prepared to the same thing you just did, requiring less energy and less stress. So that acute response is a functional adaptation, right? And so using that word much more literally, it's taking all the information, all the pieces that you used, all the configurations, and having them increase their force production and get more prepared, right? Including excitatory and inhibitory responses based off of co-activation, common drive, whatever you need to get better at that thing. Functionally, your body just reorganizes stuff to be prepared for that thing. So one thing that we've seen in the course, which what we try to do is from the beginning of the day to the end of the day when we do in-person learning, is we have someone do one potentiation exercise, if you will, checking to see how much it improves their range of motion. Now, we don't really push on them again to make them contract too much. What we try to see is from the beginning of the day to the end of the day, do they keep the range of motion adaptations every hour? And if they do, how does that look? And if it changes, by how much? Because I do believe in the same skill acquisition center and repetition of a skill, that acute adaptation can absolutely be learned as a chronic adaptation, right? So acute can be seconds, minutes, days, sometimes weeks, right? Long-term potentiation is like weeks, months, and sometimes years where your body is just slightly more prepared. It has to do with the intensity of what you do. So in reality, which is really cool, which I think is really amazing when we're working with people who are struggling with pain and they find certain exercises and positions help them feel better. If we can have them contract in those positions that make them feel better over and over again, strategically trying to periodize them appropriately, I believe that those positions could be learned and stay strong. And when I say believe, all that data collection is really qualitatively based off of my communication by my hands, my manual assessments of motor control, their communication, and observing their range of motion displacement, which I think is really, really fascinating and really cool. So I hope that helps there. But I think it's neat because it's not just about the muscles. It's about the whole motor learning process and how your body reacts to things like disturbances, as Anoka describes, and make sure that you can still have the outcome of contracting muscles in the way you like efficiently.
So, Brandon, that's fascinating. If it's okay, I'd like to shift gears a little bit. Can we talk about post-activation potentiation and muscular testing?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting discussion because, I mean, manual muscle testing, I think, needs a bit of a framing there. There's absolutely, in clinical kinesiology, applied kinesiology, many other paradigms, there's this idea that you can test individual muscles or test individual positions that have a correlation with something, like a poor interaction between one of the neurological mechanisms, a subluxation, an intolerance to a nutrient or something like that, an allergy. And I think it's really tough to use that because first and foremost, as we've learned, if you contract muscle in any regards, even if you're holding magnesium in one hand and someone pushes on you, that contraction to even hold that position on the other side and hold the magnesium, there are contractile phenomena that are happening just from doing that. So you could get better at contracting just from holding the magnesium, regardless that there's magnesium. It could be a battery in your hand or it could be nothing. And the other side of it is that manual muscle testing very much in a short conversation. Because if you want to learn a lot, there's a 3-day course that the guys at the Muscle System Consortia did and super in depth. But the idea of binaryism around testing, right? You put your arm out, for whatever reason, I apply force on you and I go, you're weak. Here's the problem. You're strong. Good, right? If I'm just overtly weaker than you are and you're a superstar strong athlete and I can't produce enough force to get the reaction level that I need, so whatever that means, you're not going to get accurate data. It's really impossible to put one limb into a piston to apply force on it and say, you're weak or you're strong. My wife is 5'2", and she's very strong, but I'm much stronger than she is. So it's easy for me to put her in a position like a traditionally named QL test, like a lateral flexion test, have all this leg distance for torque production, apply force at her legs and see, you can't maintain this left laterally flexed position. And that might have nothing to do with some sort of problem going on in the contractile system or organization. It could be the individual's not prepared for that position. It could be that I'm stronger than she is. She could have an injury. She could be fatigued. It could be early in the morning and she hasn't contracted enough. Therefore, the amount of force I applied on her in that quick second was more than she was prepared for. But if I just waited 30 seconds, we'd see a big difference. It's really tough, right? So you can't go manual muscle test equals this. And so even within our practice, Glenn, as you know, there's this thing that we use called qualitative manual assessments of motor control. And I think that's an more interesting way of going about using your hands for diagnostics for the client because it involves both the client and you, and it involves both sides of the client's body. And so you could really push on both sides and go, there seems to be some difference in quality from one side to the other. How does that feel to the client? But then here's the big problem, is if you do that, and you see that left side shoulder abduction is lower quality reaction to the right side, even if you use a dynamometer for more quantitative metrics, you're still potentially potentiating the muscle just by performing the test. by performing some diagnostics. And so this is where it gets weird when you get into qualitative assessments, manual muscle testing, doing extremes of range of motion for assessments. I mean, anything that involves the extreme of a position at the end length of a muscle with lots of force production, you're potentially PAP and you're accidentally preparing the muscle for the potentiation response to happen. And so I think that there needs to be, it's not just about manual muscle testing, villainizing, but really, if you put someone in an extreme stretch position and you try to push on them to apply force on them to see how much further they can go with some passive force, that in itself may create a potentiation effect in the shoulder, the lengthened position of the shoulder extensor side of things, or something like that. So it gets weird, but how could we strategically use this? Because I think this is kind of a cool thing, right? Let's go back. Let's forget about muscle testing, but go back to that extreme stretching example, right? The number of times I've seen a high-level strength conditioning coach put someone into a shoulder position and lean on their arm. I mean, I even had a football player who put his leg up to 90 degrees of hip flexion and let his leg roll out. And he said, hey, can you push on my leg to touch the ground? If you do it for a minute, I'll be able to touch the ground consistently. So I don't know for sure, but my hypothesis is that forgetting about short side or long side, right? If that person has their position, their body in a lengthened position of the, in this case, horizontal adductors, if I push on them and that muscle is safeguarding reflexive contracting, even to a small degree, small amount, and I don't fatigue it or hurt that thing, there's a possibility that that muscle is going to get potentiated in the length end and be more prepared to contract in that position. So I don't know if range of motion changes are directly correlated with loosening. I think it has to do with greater tensegrity, higher qualities of tension from one side to the other, which allows the individual to have more control there. And because they can control both sides of the equation, they can go further. So here's what's cool. So if that's the case, right, you go all the way back there and the lengthened side gets potentiated accidentally. Well, if you could see that consistently, if you could have the client and or individual who's seeing the motion changes practice contracting in that active range of motion position at a high level, using a machine, using a wall, using some external system where they're voluntarily doing its thing within their active range of motion, I believe, I shouldn't say that, I've seen it within many clients, hundreds of clients actually, that they can keep those changes. They can teach their body how to perform there. So I think muscle testing, qualitative testing, stretching, foam rolling, all that stuff, I think all of them create a really unique assessment to see how the body responds to force. And if that's the case, we should step away from those diagnostic pushes all the time and go to, it was the contraction in this position that made that huge change. How can I expedite this process? By focusing on that contraction.
Yeah, so it sounds like one of the big reasons that, and we've talked about this in previous podcasts, that yoga might help people improve their range of motions because they're starting to visit these end ranges and they're using this post-activation potentiation technique when they're going to yoga maybe several times a week or every day or whatever that looks like, to potentiate their body to recognize that, hey, these end ranges are stronger. We've been upregulating the contractile activity in these positions more frequently. And if you keep with that long enough, you might actually be able to hold on to that range of motion as a way of being in day-to-day life. Very similar, as you just said, with resistance training, where if people are visiting these ranges of motion more often and they're potentiating it more often, they soon find they get to keep these ranges of motion in their day-to-day life.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing example, right? And this is where, I mean, I've seen one of our international colleagues, Hubens, talk about this, and one of his posts was strength training can increase mobility better. And I was like, well, that's perfect. Because if you look at these crazy power lifters, especially the older school ones, because the newer ones are not doing this, but old school, 90s, 2000s power lifters, right? They all walked around like they had rashes under their armpits in between their legs and they had no mobility. And everyone would say, I don't want to train like that because I don't want to lose mobility. I would beg that most of those athletes stepping away from the yoga, Pilates, or powerlifting, that they don't practice visiting those extremes of position that they're capable of going. And they perform at such a high level in these mid-range positions that are barbell related to their big three or whatever else they do, that they're superstars at performing in that range, but they don't ever practice kneeling on the ground and getting back up. And if they just practice contracting in those positions, provided they have the joint positions, right, range of available contractile lengths and range of available joint positions to get there, then they can keep it. And I think this is where yoga and Pilates and modalities that take a mixture of isometric contractions in a position and aggressive stretches see some interesting results, because in yoga, you have this medley of extreme stretch into a position, probably not doing great things. Don't know for sure. But then you go into another position like a warrior where you're standing there and contracting the position. You have all these organizations. You get this interesting medley of forcing yourself into a motion, potentially losing control, but then contracting in another range, and maybe there's a transfer there. I just don't know if those extreme ranges, the risk is worth it, but it's kind of a cool thing to think about.
Absolutely. So Brandon, as an adjunct here, I was looking through my PAP manual, and something caught my eye because I didn't quite remember what it was. I'm hoping you could refresh my memory here. Post-contraction sensory discharge. What is that?
Well, it's interesting. So when I was reading about this, a lot of the studying I did was from Principles of Neuroscience and then Roger Anoka's book. And in the acute adaptations, there was this thing, there's a lot of really cool stuff like activation spillover and stuff like that. But there's one thing that, and I don't know if this should be quantified as something for people to follow, but when I was teaching more bodybuilders, there was always this question of, well, this doesn't feel the same from one side to the other. I don't have that sensation on one side. And even with clients to now, like nowadays, 65 plusers, and they're like, hey, it's weird. When I do it on this side, I feel this. When I do it on this side, I feel something totally different. And so following the same line, right? Post-activation sensory or post-contraction sensory discharge describes, which makes perfect sense, that after you contract a muscle, there's an influx of sensation from one side to the other. And so the experiment that I was posing in this, because what I try to do in the course is, when I can do the practical portion, is that we bring up a principle or a concept, and then we try to collectively as a group set up some experiment to see if there's some validity there or some pragmatic application. And I think it's interesting because in most cases, as you've experienced, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but many of the trainers here have experienced, is that if you get someone to contract on one side, and then you go to a side that feels different, less optimal, heavier, different, like instead of feeling the whole shoulder muscles, you just feel anterior delt. If you practice contracting in that position over time, you can get closer to a similar sensation from one side to the other. The whole point of this section really is that sensation really plays a massive part in how well we perform. And we can't really measure this, right? As fitness professionals, we can't go, well, we're sensation specialists. But it's to the point that I've done this with people in the class jokingly because I'm trying to show something, right? I took a big fella named Ari. Well, I didn't do this Ari. I took somebody else, right? And they're laying on their back and they do hip flexion and they show how high they can go and they do it 3 times. So we check it. And then I take a feather and I skim the skin of the front of their shin very lightly. And then we go back and recheck the motion 3 times and the range of motion has increased 3 times. Each time. And so it's very interesting that sensation has such an important role in this thing. So I think learning about the things that influence contractile sensation is important. It's not necessarily a huge section of the course, but something to bring up because I think there's interesting effects that come from asymmetrical sensation and then how that influences symmetrical performance.
No, absolutely, Brandon. I'm always very curious about the effect of feeling something more on one side than the other, and if that really matters. And I suppose that's all very dependent person to person.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think that's in exercise land, there's a insane amount of symmetrical exercises. And so, the example that I always think of is that a friend of mine in the family years ago went and bought soup from a grocery store. And when he grabbed it, the styrofoam cup was so hot because the soup was boiling hot that the cup melted right through and burned the skin on his one hand. And his one hand was completely damaged skin forever. And so forgetting about muscles, right? If you have all this damaged skin and the sensory information is so different from one side to the other, and you take that and you grab a bar, right? You try to deadlift, you try to bench press, you try to push on a machine. The sensation from one hand to another will overtly influence the performance of the relative tissue because that sensation, which again is not a measurable thing and not something that we teach about how to mess with because we really can't, but that sensation is a sensory organ to tell your body how much it should use to do the thing that's about to do. And if you're getting mixed senses mixed information, your body's going to have a hodgepodge of stuff. And even if it's only a 10% difference, your muscles are going to perform 10% differently from one side to the other, which means something where you're doing a maximal performance like a 1 rep max or an endurance excursion is going to almost always have a difference from one side to the other.
Yeah, mixed information sounds a lot like me dating in university, but I appreciate your point of view. So Brandon, I know we both encourage other personal trainers and other exercise professionals that we work with, that we speak to, or might look up to us, to bring this kind of exercise scientist way of thinking about exercise to the conversation, right? To put on the rational thinking cap and examine exercise, and not take everything for granted or as gospel, or take tradition as the way to do things, but to ask, is this the best way rationally and empirically? And so as an exercise scientist yourself, how do you see applying post-activation potentiation to exercise? And I know you've talked about a couple ways, but if you could broad stroke it for everyone listening, I'd appreciate it, and I'm sure they'd appreciate it too.
First and foremost, I would say, and I appreciate you even saying it, but I am by no means an exercise scientist, and I hate saying it. No one really is. I would say that I like to play the role of an exercise science explorer, and I like to learn as much as I can, because I do know people who are exercise scientists, and I would never want to take anything away from how much goes into being a real exercise scientist. But I do think trying to take the most scientific approach that an individual can with this application and this information is very important. The more you can learn about science and having a thought process and the science of anatomy, of physiology of muscle, goes a really, really, really long way. So the first thing I'd say to what you said is, whoever's listening to this, make a list. In your opinion, what does being scientific mean to you? And in most cases, there's, reevaluating data, exploring, learning about a body, facts or truths systematically, and arranging it in a way, right? Everyone's got a different interpretation. And so the first thing I'd say is, when you think about the muscles and the body, do you follow those same rules of a scientific thought process that you just outlined? If you look up the scientific method, or you just look up the noun science in a dictionary, are you adhering to those rules? And in most cases, I don't think people are, and that's okay. There's room to grow there, which is super cool. What I would suggest for most folks is, I think, using range of motion as a very narrow scope, but an interesting way to start practicing to see if there's differences from one side of the body, is an okay place to start. Now, first and foremost, posture, structural differences, contractile history, all that will influence range of motion and how someone performs from one side to the other. So that makes it tough. But you absolutely could have someone stand there and you could assess shoulder flexion on one side and then the other, and you go, your right side shoulder flexion has less motion. Let's see if we improve the contraction of it doing some contraction exercise. Can we make it better? And so I think a great place to start is having someone go to that end range, and either on the side of approximation or the side of lengthening, have them perform an isometric contraction, push into a wall, and just have them squeeze. And try to, using, Charlie McMillan did a great scale called the PEC scale, where he goes 5%, 25, 50, 75%, and 100%. Try to progress up. Can you push 5%? How'd that feel? Did you like it? Do you feel safe? Good. Go 25, 50, 75, 100. Just do 3 seconds. Small contractions. And then go back and reassess that motion. And in most cases where the motion has some opportunity to change, where there's that difference from one side to the other, you'll see some difference. You might see it be lighter. And if that's the case, in my opinion, if symmetry is a part of your goal, or that motion is a big part of what you want to do to perform, you should do that, a couple times a day for a couple days. And then do it a little less frequently and a little less frequently, and try to see how you do. On the other side of the equation, sorry, Glenn, what were you going to say there? Sorry for
No, I didn't realize you were pausing. I was about to preface you for some more information, but keep going, buddy. Keep going.
Right. So the last thing I would say is that if you're doing something like a symmetrical exercise, like a bench press or a deadlift, right? Let's go with bench press. I think what a great thing to do, like we've done with the machines that we've got here, and this is why I love the Kaiser machines, is try to add more resistance on the eccentric load to do close to maximal or sub-maximal voluntary eccentric contraction. I mean, for bench press, one of my favorite things to do is get on the Kaiser chest press machine, put it all the way out into extension, increase the resistance just so it starts to beat me eccentrically a little bit, stop increasing the resistance so I don't make it to a dangerous load, and then control the eccentric down, decrease it, and repeat that just 3 times. And you get this really cool, close to maximal effect. And 9 times out of 10, when you go to your actual exercise lift, you'll realize how much lighter everything feels. And it's super cool. So I hope those are 2 different applications there.
No, I really appreciate it, Brandon. And I guess just to round it off, is there anything else that you want to say about post-activation potentiation before we get into our final segment?
Honestly, I mean, I have a course on this, and anyone who's listening to this, I would love for you to take the course. I think there's a lot of great information in there to open up the mind and perspective. In fact, the manual is right here, Post-Activation Potentiation, with a cool development logo. I love it. I would say this in closing for anyone who's listened to this whole podcast. The thing to take away from it is, if we go to the hamburger analogy and all these other things we've talked about over a series of episodes, of podcasts, potentiation is happening whether you like it or not. The changes in force production, part of the reason why people get better as contracting after the day, as the day goes on, why sometimes stretches or exercise in the morning feels better than other times. You are getting better at contracting by moving every time. PAP is a thing, and there's a lot of permutations of acute adaptations that are happening at the same time concurrently. And there's a lot of stuff like common drive and other elements of co-activation we haven't even explored, but that's part of what the course is for. If you recognize that muscular contractions are happening and the influence of muscular contractions elicits the PAP response, you can take your therapy, your releasing strategy, your rolling, whatever you do, and you can strategically focus on contracting the muscles to expedite the process. I don't care about anyone who's listening to this, throwing out all their stuff. Don't stop foam rolling if you don't want to. That's fine. But how much more valuable of a personal trainer or exercise professional do you end up being if you can learn about what's making those changes, focus on that, and make the same changes in seconds that you were making in minutes before by causing someone excruciating pain? In my opinion, that level of efficiency and individualization is worth so much more than putting a 200-pound person on a foam roller for 5 minutes, watching them squeal and telling them to roll on one erector until their nose is bleeding. Facetiously saying that, of course. So if it's happening, the more you learn about it and all these other things, amazing. You can get better results with what you're already doing, and maybe rethink how you're currently doing warm-ups and other strategies and get more out of it.
Yeah, I did the PAP course a few years ago, I think maybe 5 or 6 in your first iteration. It was a great course. I highly recommend it, and I'm sure, in fact, I know Brandon's updated it since then. So please check out the PAP course. Brandon, how can people find out more about it?
If anyone wants to find out more about it, if you go to stratainternalperformance.com, there is a education for trainers section. I have an education website that I'm in the midst of working on, which there'll be more information on. I'll be publicly announcing it on Strata Biomechanics and Strata Internal Performance's page. Probably do it in the story for the Minds on Muscle as well on Instagram. And yeah, please just reach out if you find me anywhere, any socials, just ask questions, and I'd love to get you guys going. I'm planning, as soon as I get information about Ontario's reopening, and at the moment it is February 9th. Actually, funny enough, it was 4 years ago exactly that I did the first course, which is nuts. It has been 4 years. It's February 9th, so in the next couple of weeks we find out when Ontario reopens. But what's important about that for this is I will be doing an online version where I've got a bunch of people from Brazil and Portugal who'll be joining, which I'm super excited about. It'll be a slightly modified version of the course, but I'm excited to get the information out there. So don't hesitate to reach out. Would love to talk to you.
StrataInternalPerformance.com. Look under the education section. Brandon, last question of the day. What is your pick of the week?
My pick of the week in vein of PAP is buy yourself a crane scale, dynamometer, or a fishing scale. Because one of the most amazing things that helps this is if you're just observing someone's range of motion and you have some sort of confirmation bias where you want to see change, it's super easy to go, look, you made a change, and be super biased. But numbers don't lie. So if you want to try and get more device-based contraction stimuluses, and you want to measure quantitatively what's going on, grab something that's got a metric on it, something that's got a peak force measurement system, and grab it. I've got a bunch of them, so if you want to reach out and ask. Honestly, my favorite and cheapest one is just a Bass Pro fishing scale, or a what is it called? Samsonite, right? The baggage stuff from those TV shows, right? Samsonite bag scale's got a little peak measuring device, and you can see how things are changing. So definitely pick something up, mess around with it, and stay tuned to see little examples of this as we continue forward. But Glenn, I mean, you've been asking me so many great questions. What is your pick of the week?
My pick of the week is easy. It's a movie that Louise and I watched last week. And you know me, I'm a major cinephile. And that is the movie Soul. We watched it on Disney Plus, voiced by Jamie Foxx and Tina Fey. I don't even know how to begin to go into this movie. It's about a gentleman who's supposed to go to the great beyond, but he doesn't feel like he's ready to go yet. And so he learns about himself and about personalities and about like the world. And I mean, I guess it's just Disney's take almost on metaphysics. So it's very, very fascinating, great to watch. And it's got a great message at the very end, which is to enjoy every moment. And it's delivered in a way that only amazing storytellers can. Excuse me. I'm talking so fast and I'm spilling over my words. So my pick of the week is Soul. Watch on Disney Plus. Highly recommend. You will not take your eyes off the screen at all. And I'm also happy it's not a musical. So thumbs up.
And I think everyone should watch WandaVision because I'm a super Marvel nerd, and that's on Disney Plus as well, and it is awesome.
Absolutely. I got through. We won't talk about it too much because it might be excluding people. I just finished episode 5 earlier this morning. I'm in love with the show. The first couple I was a little weirded out by, but like I'm loving where it's going.
So is that the newest one or is that the second newest one?
It would be the most recent one.
Oh, yes. The ending is epic. I'm excited to see where they go.
Yeah. Well, this is going to set up the whole phase 4 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So phase 5, I think. So I'm very excited for it, but we'll digress because maybe we're just talking about Brandon and Glenn things at this point.
Spoiler alert, someone comes from the Fox universe and jumps over. Whoops. Okay, everyone, thank you so much for listening to this episode. Glenn, thanks so much for asking all these questions and entertaining me by asking about PAP. I'm excited to share it, and I really appreciate this time. So thanks for asking all these questions.
You are welcome, Brandon. I love talking about PAP and interviewing you and having discussions around it. So the pleasure is all mine. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please check us out on YouTube, Podbean, Spotify, and iTunes. And we also have a wonderful brick and mortar facility in Newmarket, just north of Leslie and Davis Drive, which we hopefully will be opening up in the next couple of weeks. We are dedicated to being safe and healthy and helping people. And I'm really excited to be back at work with people for the upteenth time. By this time, I think we're going to be sticking around for the long haul.
Couldn't agree more. Everyone, if you like this, please pass this along, share it. We'd love to have more people find the information. Glenn and I are actually right now going to have a quick meeting because we've got some really exciting guests coming up in the next few weeks, which we're going to keep you posted on. You'll see it's going to be really good. So please subscribe, pass this information along, stay tuned. If you have anybody you want us to chat to who is an influential fitness professional figure or someone who's involved in this world, send us a link. We'd love to meet with them and chat with them. Glenn and I are excited to share more info with you guys.
Exercisers assemble.
Exercisers assemble. Thanks, Glenn.
Have a great day, everybody.